think some of you, know my name from the business for going into the past, perhaps even back as far as M&K Sound when I was doing the real-time direct-to-disc records, those recordings with Ken Kreisel. Those have popped up again from time to time as benchmarks for quality. I was a pretty young guy back then. We're talking late 70s when I went to work for Jonas Miller Sound in Beverly Hills to sell equipment. And then I wound up working for Ken Kreisel. He asked me to come and work for M&K. And the first job I did with Ken was to help him with the M&K Realtime Direct-to-Disc series of recordings. That was a project that was a labor of love for Ken. He bought a Neumann SX70 lathe system, modified it by taking out the current limiters and acceleration limiters, built a studio around it, and we did most of these recordings right in the Jonas Miller Sound store, which was a large open room. It was just a kind of a giant open structure where we had room dividers, not unlike these dividers here. We could move around and subdivide little sections for to set up equipment and systems and show them off. And we would shuffle things out of the way. Ken bought a grand piano, put it in the store, and we would bring the musicians in right there and move equipment out of the way and set up and do the recordings right there with AKG C414 microphones that Ken had modified, and Levinson preamplifiers that we had stripped out the RIAA equalization from and used them as our microphone preamps. And all of that would feed into a passive mixer of Ken's design, and then into a Mark Levinson LNP2 as a master controller that fed the lathe system. But it was a very interesting experience for me. Ken was definitely the head of that whole project, but I was lucky enough to be right there beside him working on these recordings through that period of time, along with a few other people. Steve Decker was another engineer who actually ran the lathe. I would do a lot of the microphone setup and equipment setup, and just get everything in the right place at the right time. Ken did the mixing, and of course he and Jonas and a few other people coordinated with the musicians and set all this up. Then Ken decided to step this up to another level, and if any of you have ever done live location recording with tape equipment or digital equipment, you know how difficult that can be. But imagine doing it with a lathe, a Neumann lathe. We took that thing out on location and did live direct-to-disc recordings with it. We did the Roger Wagner Chorale. We did Flamenco Fever over a couple of days. We did a full orchestra and chorus, the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in a theater in downtown Los Angeles. It was an incredible amount of work, but rewarding and interesting, a huge learning experience. So it was a lot of fun. And those records today, some of them have stood the test of time as among some of the better sounding LPs that have been created. People, of course, always argue about the musical merits. I won't go into that, but the sound of the records themselves is remarkable. But I'll tell you what, as good as those records are, I wish there was some way you could have heard the acetates that they were made from. This was another difficult thing to learn, but the acetates, of course, were the final ones that were chosen, that were complete takes, were sent off to Teldec in Germany to be plated and turned into pressings, and then we'd get test pressings back. Ken would improve those, and then finally they would go to pressing. And when these test pressings came back and we listened to them, I was used to working, in the studio with the lathe system, and we could play back acetates that were blown for one reason or another. These were precious things, and the material itself is kind of soft. You typically never play an acetate that you're going to turn into an album because it can be damaged. You will lose some information. But we would oftentimes have, for one reason or another, something, an incomplete take, something would happen technically that caused a problem, and we could play back the acetates that were not going to be turned into pressings. To this day, they are the best sounding recorded media I have ever heard in my life. They are better than anything I've ever listened to, and the sad fact is that the test pressings that came back didn't sound as good as the acetates that they were made from. Unfortunately, there's just a loss in that process. I have experienced, in a similar way, I guess that, technically it's different, but working on editing and mastering digital recordings for CD particularly with my friend Jim Murad of Blueport Jazz, I've run into this again where these pressings would come back and not sound as good as the mastered originals that I had sent to them. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but suffice it to say that you have to pay a lot of attention. Once the recording is done, which is a difficult process, once the editing and mastering and all this work is done, you still have something you have to kind of shepherd through the production process to wind up with a final product that isn't, or that is representative of what you're trying to put out there. So there's lots of pitfalls along the way, lots of places where things can go wrong. So I admire, anybody who's working to put out good recordings and manages to put out a good sounding piece in the end. It takes a lot of work. Anyway, that was an early formative experience. Then I've been in various parts of the industry since that time. Worked with Spatial Coherence, a company making an unusual preamplifier back in the early 80s, and then went to work with Marcel Riendeau up in Canada with the Oracle turntable, which I distributed for a while in the US, and then went to Canada briefly to work with Marcel on product development and doing dealer liaison work and marketing. And then moved back to California where I started the Mod Squad in 1982. And some of you may remember Tiptoes and possibly the Line Drive. Someone mentioned a passive preamplifier, the Line Drive series of preamps. Early CD player modifications that led to my own CD player products, the DNA amplifier series, etc. So I've had an interesting time with all of that. Now, that evolved into McCormack Audio, and that whole business was predicated on the notion of making high-performance gear that was high value. It was designed to deliver performance perhaps above and beyond its price range, but be quite affordable, reasonably priced gear. But of course, as a designer, what you really would like to do is have carte blanche to just go to town and do, let your imagination run wild and do the best you possibly can with everything. After McCormack Audio was sold in the late 90s to Conrad Johnson, I started a small business of my own, SMc Audio.